Before we begin, if you enjoy story narrations like this, consider subscribing so you don't miss future ones.
The Neon Mirage had been closed for years, its marquee letters missing, its interior a skeleton of rust and graffiti. Behind it, between a chain-link fence and a dumpster, the body lay half-curled, face turned toward the sky as if searching for a light that would not come. Detective Amina Qureshi had seen bodies in worse places, on rooftops, in riverbeds, in the back seats of cars. But there was something about this one that made her stomach tighten. The clothes were plain, a thrift store coat, a sweater with a moth-eaten cuff, shoes that had once been expensive but were now scuffed and cheap. The hands were small and pale, the nails bitten to the quick. No ID, no prints, no report. Those three facts were the first to be recorded, the first to be repeated like a litany. The coroner took photographs, swabbed for DNA, and catalogued the clothing. The patrol officer who had found the body, young, with a face that still believed in tidy endings, said he had checked the pockets and found nothing. No wallet, no phone, no note. Amina watched the technicians work and felt the city press in around her, the hum of traffic, the distant thump of a nightclub bass, the smell of fried food from a late-night stall. She had been a detective long enough to know that the absence of evidence was itself a kind of evidence. Someone had wanted this person to be unfindable. She ordered the usual, canvass the area, check CCTV, run the DNA through the database, check missing persons reports from the last 5 years. The lab would take time. The cameras were mostly dead or vandalized. The alley was a place people passed through but did not remember. The first night yielded nothing but the cold. By morning, the case had a name in the system. Unidentified male, age estimated 28-35. The estimate was a courtesy. The body could have been younger or older. The gender marker was a placeholder, a bureaucratic convenience. Amina did not like placeholders. She called in a favor at the hospital and had the body moved to a private room where she could sit with it for a while. The coroner, a blunt man named Farid, told her the cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head, probably from a single heavy blow. Time of death, between midnight and 3 a.m., no defensive wounds, no signs of prolonged torture. The victim had been alone when it happened. No ID? Amina asked. No prints in the system, Farid said. No dental records. No implants. No tattoos that match any database. Whoever this was, they were off the grid. Amina thought of the family houses she had driven past in her career, gated, manicured, with security cameras that watched the street like hawks. She thought of the people who could afford to disappear someone without leaving a paper trail. She thought of the people who could afford to hide a child away. She did not yet know that she was thinking of the right family. The house on Crescent Lane had a private gate and a fountain that whispered at night. Inside, the rooms were arranged to keep the world at bay. A library with leather-bound books, a conservatory with orchids that never wilted, a wing of the house that had been converted into a suite for a person who would never be seen in public. The family called it the guest suite. The staff called it the quiet wing. The person who lived there, whom the family called Evelyn in private, and Evan in public documents, had been born into the family with a body that did not match the image the family wanted to present. The family had decided when the child was small that the child would be kept out of sight. They hired nurses, tutors, and a private physician. They paid for therapies and for a string of specialists who offered euphemisms and medical jargon. They paid for silence. Evelyn grew up in a house that smelled of lemon oil and antiseptic. She learned to move quietly, to speak softly, to avoid the mirrors in the hallways. She learned to read the faces of the staff and to know which ones would look away and which ones would linger with pity. She learned to be grateful for the small mercies, a window that opened to a courtyard, a radio that played old songs, a stack of books that no one else read. Loneliness became a companion. It was not the dramatic loneliness of a person who had been cast out. It was the slow, patient loneliness of someone who had been hidden. Evelyn's world was a series of rooms and routines. She had a tutor who taught her languages and mathematics, a music teacher who taught her to play the piano, and a gardener who brought her cuttings of roses. She had a nurse who would sometimes bring her out to the back garden at dusk and tell her stories about the city beyond the gate. The nurse's name was Maria, and Maria's hands smelled of soap and cigarettes. Evelyn learned to watch the world through the slats of blinds. She learned the names of the cars that passed the gate, the faces of the delivery men, the cadence of the city beyond the walls. She learned that the family had wealth enough to buy almost anything, except the right to be seen. The family's fear was not of violence or poverty. It was of shame, a brittle, old-fashioned word that had the power to ruin reputations, marriages, and business deals. They had built their lives on appearances, a patriarch who sat on boards, a matriarch who hosted charity galas, cousins who married into other families with careful pedigrees. A child who did not fit the public image was a risk, so they hid Evelyn away. Evelyn's life was not entirely without kindness. There were moments, rare and bright, when a cousin would slip her a note, when a gardener would leave a peach on her windowsill, when a book would arrive with a dedication in a shaky hand. But those moments were exceptions, not the rule. The rule was silence. Secrets have a market. In the city, there are people who make a living by knowing what others want to hide. They are not always criminals in the dramatic sense. Sometimes they are accountants. Sometimes they are lawyers. Sometimes they are people who work in the grey spaces between privacy and exposure. They collect information like coins, and they trade it for favors, for money, for power. Evelyn's family had paid handsomely to keep their secret. They had paid doctors to falsify records, lawyers to draft non-disclosure agreements, and staff to maintain the fiction that the quiet wing was a guest suite. They had paid for a life that existed in the margins of their own. But money does not erase the human need for connection. Evelyn, who had been taught to be invisible, found ways to reach out. She learned to use the internet in secret, to send messages under assumed names, to read forums where people wrote about lives they could not live openly. She learned to barter with the staff, a favor for a favor, a promise for a promise. She learned that the world outside the gate was messy and dangerous, but it was also full of people who would not look away. One of those people was a man named Rafik. He was not a criminal mastermind. He was a fixer, a man who knew how to get things done. He had once been a driver for the family, then a personal assistant, then a man who had been quietly dismissed when he asked too many questions. He had a ledger of favors and a memory like a steel trap. He knew where the family kept their receipts, their off-the-books accounts, and the names of the people they paid to keep quiet. Rafik also knew Evelyn. He had seen her once, years ago, when he had been allowed into the quiet wing to deliver a package. He had seen the way she looked at the window, the way she traced the pattern of the glass with her finger. He had seen the way she smiled when he told her a joke. He had kept that memory like a small, hot coal. People like Rafik are dangerous because they are not always motivated by malice. They are motivated by need. Rafik had debts. He had a sister who needed an operation. He had a son who wanted to study. He had a life that required money. The family's secret was a commodity he could sell. Blackmail began as a whisper. A note slipped under a door. A photograph left on a car seat. The family paid at first, quietly, with cash and with promises. They thought they could buy their way out of everything. They were wrong. The first payment was small, a few thousand in unmarked bills. The second was larger. The demands escalated. The blackmailer, who sometimes used the name M in messages, knew details that only someone with access could know. They knew the dates of Evelyn's medical appointments, the names of the nurses, the code words the family used. They knew that Evelyn sometimes left the house at night to walk the gardens and listen to the city. The family tightened their security. They replaced staff. They installed cameras. They hired a private security firm. They thought that would be the end of it. But secrets have a way of slipping through the cracks. Evelyn, for her part, did not know the full extent of the blackmail. She knew only that there were people who wanted to use her existence as leverage. She felt like an object in a ledger, a line item that could be traded. The knowledge of being traded was a new kind of loneliness. Someone knew the secret and did not keep it to themselves. That someone was not a single person, but a constellation of people whose lives intersected in small, dangerous ways. There was Rafik, who had once loved Evelyn in the way a man loves a memory. There was Maria the nurse, who had a soft spot for the person she had watched grow up in the quiet wing. There was a cousin who resented the attention the family paid to appearances and who had a grudge that had festered into something colder. There was a lawyer who had kept a file in a safe deposit box and who had a gambling problem. The blackmailer used these intersections like threads. They pulled one here, tugged another there, and watched the fabric of the family's life unravel. The demands became more audacious. Public exposure unless the family transferred funds to an offshore account. A list of names unless the family agreed to a humiliating public statement. Proof of Evelyn's existence unless the family agreed to relinquish control. The family, in their panic, made mistakes. They sent men to follow Rafik. They offered hush money to the cousin. They tried to buy the lawyer's silence. Each attempt to control the situation created new vulnerabilities. The blackmailer adapted, shifting tactics, exploiting the family's fear. Amina, the detective, began to see the outlines of this web. She had pulled the family's financials as part of a routine background check. Wealthy families often had skeletons that showed up in bank transfers and shell companies. She had found a pattern of payments to obscure accounts, payments that coincided with dates when the family had been particularly anxious. She had found a name that recurred in the margins, E.H. The initials matched no one in the public records, but they matched the name the family used in private. Amina requested a warrant to search the Crescent Lane property. The family resisted, of course. They had lawyers and influence. They argued about privacy and the sanctity of the home. They offered to cooperate in limited ways. Amina pushed. She had a body and a crime scene and a duty to find out who had been killed and why. When the warrant was served, the quiet wing was immaculate. The staff were composed. The family wore grief like a costume. They had rehearsed their statements. They had prepared for the cameras. But the search turned up things that could not be rehearsed away. A hidden ledger with names and dates, a stack of letters in a locked drawer, a phone with encrypted messages. The ledger had entries that matched the offshore transfers Amina had found. The letters were addressed to Evelyn in a hand that trembled with affection. "We kept her safe," the matriarch said when Amina confronted her. "We did what we had to do." "Safe from what?" Amina asked. The matriarch's eyes flicked away. "From scandal. From being a person," Amina said softly. The family bristled. They had been taught to think of Evelyn as a problem to be managed, not as a person with desires and rights. The search revealed more than financial records. It revealed the architecture of a life built to be invisible. The blackmailer grew bolder. They released a photograph to a tabloid, a grainy image of Evelyn at a market, hair loose, laughing with a vendor. The tabloid ran the story with a headline that implied scandal. The family issued a terse denial and a threat of legal action. The blackmailer responded with more, a video clip, a medical record, a letter from a nurse who had been paid to keep quiet. Public pressure mounted. The family's board members began to whisper about reputational risk. A charity withdrew an invitation. A business partner postponed a merger. The family's carefully constructed world began to tilt. Evelyn, who had never asked for any of this, found herself at the center of a storm. She had been living in a house that was a gilded cage. Now the bars were being pried open by people who wanted to profit from her existence. She felt exposed in a way she had never imagined. She felt like a specimen under a microscope. Rafiq, who had been the first to see Evelyn as more than a secret, tried to protect her. He met with Maria in a parking garage and begged her to help. Maria, who had her own debts and her own fears, agreed to pass along a message. "We can get you out." The plan was simple and dangerous. Evelyn would leave the house at night, meet Rafiq at a safe house, and disappear into the city where she could live on her own terms. The family discovered the plan. They called in security. They confronted Rafiq. There was a scuffle in the driveway, a shouted argument, and then a moment of terrible clarity. The family realized that their secret could not be contained by money alone. They realized that the person they had hidden had a will of their own. The night Evelyn left, the city was humid and thick with the smell of rain. She slipped through the back gate with a small bag and a heart that felt like a fist. She met Rafiq under a bridge where the light was poor and the shadows were long. He took her hand and led her to a car. They did not get far. A car pulled up behind them, lights off. Men stepped out, security contractors hired by the family, men with faces like stone.
There was a struggle.
Rafiq tried to shield Evelyn.
A blow landed.
Someone shouted. Evelyn fell. The men dragged her into the car and drove away. Amina, who had been following a lead on Rafiq, arrived at the bridge to find the scene empty. A dropped glove, a smear of blood, a shoe. She called it in and began to piece together the timeline. The car that had taken Evelyn was traced to a shell company. The shell company was traced to a trust controlled by the family. The next morning, the body behind the Neon Mirage was identified by a small, private mark on a bracelet, a charm with a family crest. The coroner confirmed the identity. Evelyn was dead. When the family learned the body had been found, they did not immediately call the police. They called their lawyer. They called their publicist. They called the security firm. They called the priest. They called anyone who might help them manage the fallout. They did not call Evelyn by the name she had chosen for herself. They called her by the name on the birth certificate, the name that fit the ledger. Amina arrived at Crescent Lane with a warrant and a list of questions. The family offered condolences and rehearsed grief. They offered to cooperate in limited ways. They offered money for a private funeral. They offered to pay for a discreet burial. They offered everything except the truth, but the truth has a way of leaking out. Rafiq, who had been beaten and left with a fractured jaw, talked. Maria, who had been paid to keep quiet but could not bear the weight of what she had seen, talked. The cousin with the grudge, who had been promised silence and then threatened, talked. The lawyer, who had gambled and lost, talked. Each person who talked added a piece to the mosaic. The blackmailer, M, was revealed not as a single villain, but as a network of people who had traded in the family's fear. Some had been motivated by money, some by revenge, some by a desire to see the powerful humbled. The family had thought they could buy their way out of everything. They had not accounted for the human cost. At the trial, the family's defenses crumbled. The security contractors testified. The ledger was entered into evidence. The offshore transfers were traced. The patriarch, who had once sat on boards with men who nodded at his jokes, sat in a courtroom and watched as his life was dismantled in public. The matriarch, who had hosted galas with crystal chandeliers, watched as the charity invitations were rescinded. Neglect was the first charge that hung over them, not in the legal sense, but in the moral one. They had neglected a human being in the name of propriety. Exploitation followed. They had used their wealth to control and to silence. Hidden wealth had been the lubricant that made the exploitation possible. Blackmail had been the mechanism by which others had profited from their fear. Loneliness was the quietest, most devastating verdict. Evelyn had been alone in a house full of people. Amina sat in the courtroom and watched the family shrink under the weight of their own choices. She thought of Evelyn's hands, small and pale, and of the way she had traced the pattern of the glass with her finger. She thought of the nurse who had brought peaches and the gardener who had left cuttings. She thought of Rafik, who had loved a memory and paid for it with his bones. In the end, the legal system could punish some of the actors. Some were convicted, some were fined, some fled. But the deeper costs, the ones that money could not fix, remained. The family lost their standing, their board seats, their invitations. They lost the ability to pretend that their lives were unblemished. They lost the person they had hidden. Evelyn, who had wanted only to be seen, had been seen at last, but only as a corpse in an alley and as a headline in a tabloid. The city that had kept no ledger for her life now kept a ledger for her death. Nobody claimed the body at first. In the end, people claimed pieces of the story instead. The scandal, the money, the shame, the headlines. But the person Evelyn had been survived only in fragments. A nurse remembering a laugh.
A gardener remembering a peach left by a window.
A detective remembering a life hidden so long it nearly disappeared. The city moved on. But somewhere behind the walls of Crescent Lane, the silence remained.
Did the story send chills down your spine? And from which city are you tuning in tonight? Let's meet in the comments. If you enjoyed this dark tale, you can support me with a super thanks so I can keep uncovering more gripping true crime stories for you. Thank you so much for your support. It helps me bring even more suspenseful narratives to life. I'm looking forward to your thoughts on this mystery. There's a lot more waiting for you on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. See you in the next chilling story with intrigue and respect.